From the 5th to the 15th century, did you truly know what went on behind those monastery walls? Did medieval abbesses and nuns live lives of quiet devotion, shut away from the world, powerless and uneducated? Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about these fascinating women. Number 1. The myth of the passive medieval nun. Many people picture medieval nuns as silent, submissive figures, always deferring to male authority, with no real say in their own lives or the broader world around them. This widely held belief paints a picture of women who merely followed orders, their autonomy stripped away by the rigid structures of the church and society. It suggests they were simply recipients of male guidance, unable to assert themselves or forge their own destinies within the confines of monastic life. This view often overlooks the complex realities of power, influence, and personal agency that many religious women wielded, sometimes even in defiance of the expectations placed upon them. The idea that nuns were entirely passive overlooks centuries of spirited resistance, clever negotiation, and outright assertion of rights that allowed them to shape their institutions and even influence secular affairs. Historical records, far from supporting this simplistic narrative, reveal a vibrant tapestry of female initiative and leadership within monastic communities. Abbesses especially were not just spiritual leaders, they were formidable administrators, landholders, and often powerful political players in their own right. They managed vast estates, overseeing agriculture, trade, and even the collection of taxes from their tenants. This was no small task, demanding keen business acumen, a firm grasp of legal principles, and the ability to command respect from both their subordinates and external authorities. The chronicler Thietmar of Mersburg, writing in the early 11th century, often remarked on the considerable secular power wielded by abbesses in the Holy Roman Empire, noting their involvement in land disputes and even their military contributions to imperial campaigns. These women were certainly not passive bystanders in the grand scheme of medieval life. Beyond their administrative duties, many nuns actively asserted their spiritual authority, sometimes challenging the very structures that sought to contain them. Take, for example, the case of Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century. Her visions and theological writings, while initially met with some skepticism, gained significant traction and eventually received papal approval. Hildegard communicated directly with popes, emperors, and kings, offering advice, critiques, and spiritual guidance. Her correspondence, meticulously preserved, demonstrates her willingness to admonish powerful men, including Bernard of Clairvaux, a hugely influential figure in the monastic world. She firmly believed in the divine origin of her visions and used this conviction as a platform to speak truth to power, often with remarkable success. She founded her own independent monastery at Rupertsberg, a testament to her resolve to lead her community according to her own spiritual convictions, even when facing opposition from male ecclesiastical authorities. This was an act of profound self-determination, a far cry from passivity. Furthermore, nuns often fought fiercely to protect their monastic communities from external interference, particularly from bishops who sought to impose their authority. The Abbey of Gandersheim, for instance, famously engaged in a protracted dispute with the Bishop of Hildesheim over jurisdiction throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. The abbesses of Gandersheim, supported by the empresses and emperors of the Ottonian dynasty, consistently appealed to higher authorities, including the Pope, to uphold their independence. The records from these legal battles, preserved in various papal bulls and imperial diplomas, show the abbesses presenting their cases with eloquence and legal precision. They utilized their connections, legal knowledge, and unwavering determination to safeguard their abbey's ancient privileges. This was not a passive acceptance of hierarchical power. It was an active and often successful struggle for autonomy, demonstrating a profound understanding of legal frameworks and political maneuvering. The very choice to become a nun could, in itself, be an act of defiance or a strategic move for women who sought alternatives to arranged marriages or limited societal roles. While some women were indeed placed in convents against their will, many others actively chose this path. For aristocratic women, entering a wealthy abbey could offer a position of power and influence that was otherwise unattainable. They could pursue intellectual interests, manage significant wealth, and even act as patrons of art and learning. For a woman like Heloise, the famous correspondent of Peter Abelard in the 12th century, the monastic life provided a space for intellectual pursuit and spiritual contemplation that was perhaps more fulfilling than a conventional marriage. Her letters reveal a mind deeply engaged with theological and philosophical questions, demonstrating a profound personal agency in shaping her own intellectual and spiritual journey. Even within the daily routines of the convent, nuns exercised agency in countless ways. They managed their own daily schedules, allocated resources, and made decisions about the spiritual and practical lives of their communities. They engaged in manual labor, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, and creating intricate textiles, all of which required skill, planning, and self-direction. The creation of illuminated manuscripts, a highly skilled and time-consuming endeavor, was often undertaken by nuns, showcasing their intellectual capabilities and artistic flair. The dedication of a nun like Hrotsvit of Gandersheim, the 10th century Saxon canoness who wrote plays and epic poems, directly challenges the notion of passive, uneducated women. Her literary output reveals a sophisticated understanding of classical literature and a willingness to engage with complex moral and theological themes. These examples collectively dismantle the myth of the passive medieval nun. Instead, they reveal women who were active participants in their world, asserting their rights, managing powerful institutions, pursuing intellectual and spiritual goals, and often engaging in significant political and legal battles. Their agency might have been expressed differently than that of men in the secular world, but it was undoubtedly present and profoundly influential. The history of medieval nuns is a rich and complex narrative of women who navigated the challenges and opportunities of their time with strength, intelligence, and unwavering spirit, leaving a lasting legacy of female leadership and intellectual achievement that continues to inspire. Number 2, the myth of nunneries as dumping grounds for unwanted women. Many people believe that medieval nunneries served primarily as convenient places for families to dispose of unwanted daughters. This widespread misconception paints a bleak picture of young women, or even older widows, being forced into religious life against their will, with convents acting as little more than holding pens for those deemed unsuitable for marriage or inconvenient for family plans. This view suggests that entering a nunnery was rarely a matter of personal choice or spiritual calling, but rather a regrettable last resort, a place of exile for the unmarriageable, the disfigured, or the simply superfluous members of aristocratic households. It implies a lack of agency on the part of the women themselves, seeing them as passive victims of familial or societal pressures, with their lives decided for them rather than by them. While it is true that some women, particularly from noble families, were indeed placed in convents by their relatives, often for dynastic or economic reasons, this was far from the sole or even primary reason for entering religious life. Historical evidence reveals a much more nuanced reality, where women chose the monastic path for a multitude of reasons, often strategic, intellectual, or deeply spiritual. For many women, monastic life offered a unique opportunity for autonomy, education, and influence that was simply unavailable in the secular world. It provided an escape from the potential dangers of childbirth, the uncertainties of marriage, and the subordination inherent in a male-dominated society. For aristocratic women, choosing the veil could be a powerful political and social statement. Becoming an abbess of a prominent monastery, especially an imperial abbey, could grant a woman more power and influence than even a queen. Abbesses managed vast estates, controlled significant wealth, and often held judicial authority over their tenants. They could patronize arts and letters, engage in diplomacy, and even advise rulers. Consider the case of women like Matilda, the Abbess of Quedlinburg in the 10th century, who was a daughter of Emperor Otto I. Her position as abbess gave her a prominent role in imperial politics, far exceeding what she might have achieved as a mere noblewoman or even a queen consort. The chronicles of the time describe her as a skilled diplomat and administrator, hosting imperial diets and mediating disputes. Her choice was not one of last resort, but of strategic ascent. Education was another powerful draw for many women. While formal education was largely inaccessible to women in the secular world, nunneries often served as vibrant centers of learning, scholarship, and artistic production. Many convents maintained extensive libraries, provided instruction in Latin, theology, philosophy, and even sciences. Women who entered these communities could dedicate their lives to intellectual pursuits, copying manuscripts, composing hymns, or even writing original works. Hrotsvit of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, stands as a towering example. She wrote Latin dramas inspired by Terence, historical epics, and hagiographies, showcasing a profound intellect and literary talent. Her works were not just for internal consumption, they were circulated and celebrated beyond the convent walls. For a woman with intellectual ambitions, the convent was often the only place where these aspirations could be fully realized. This was a deliberate choice, not an imposition. Spiritual devotion naturally remained a primary motivation for many women entering monastic life. For those with a genuine calling, the convent offered a structured environment for prayer, contemplation, and service to God. Accounts from saints' lives and monastic rules emphasize the profound spiritual yearning that drew women to the cloister. The very act of taking vows was a deeply personal and transformative commitment. For example, Clare of Assisi, in the 13th century, a noblewoman, famously rejected a life of wealth and marriage to follow Francis of Assisi, founding the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. Her decision was entirely her own, driven by a fervent desire for a life of poverty and spiritual dedication, despite her family's strong opposition. Her story, widely recorded in contemporary hagiographies, illustrates a powerful and deliberate embrace of religious life. Furthermore, nunneries provided a safe haven and a sense of community for women. In a world fraught with political instability, violence, and the uncertainties of early marriage and childbirth, the stability and protection offered by a monastic community could be profoundly appealing. It offered a refuge for widows, for women who had experienced personal tragedies, or for those who simply sought a quieter, more ordered existence. The sense of sisterhood, mutual support, and shared purpose often found within these communities was a powerful magnet. The records from the 14th century English convent of Nun Appleton, for instance, detail the close bonds among the sisters and the communal efforts to manage the convent's affairs, providing a social and emotional sanctuary for its members. While some women were indeed oblates, or placed in convents at a young age, this practice often involved families dedicating a child to God. Such children were typically raised within the monastic community and given the opportunity to choose their path as adults. Not all necessarily remained, some left, while others embraced the vows they had been prepared for. The concept of choice, even if influenced by upbringing, was still present. It was not always a brutal or unwanted imposition. The notion of nunneries as mere dumping grounds simplifies a rich and diverse historical reality. It ignores the agency, intellect, and spiritual depth of countless medieval women who actively chose monastic life for a myriad of reasons, for power, for learning, for spiritual fulfillment, for security, or for a unique sense of belonging. The medieval convent was not a uniform institution, and its inhabitants were not a homogeneous group of unwilling exiles. Instead, they were women who often made profound and deliberate choices that shaped their own lives and left an indelible mark on medieval society. Number 3. The myth of strict asceticism and poverty as the universal norm. Many popular portrayals of medieval nuns suggest a uniform life of extreme asceticism and grinding poverty, where every nun endured constant deprivation, wore rough sackcloth, subsisted on meager rations, and lived in perpetually cold, drafty cells. This myth paints a picture of unrelenting hardship, where the pursuit of spiritual purity was always synonymous with physical suffering and absolute material renunciation. It suggests that all convents, regardless of their founding principles or wealth, adhered to a severe, unyielding discipline that left no room for comfort or even basic amenities, making the monastic life seem universally austere and unwelcoming. This widespread belief often overshadows the significant variations in monastic practices and the considerable wealth enjoyed by many religious houses. The reality was far more diverse. While strict asceticism was indeed a foundational principle for certain monastic orders, especially the Cistercians or some reformed Benedictine houses, it was by no means the universal norm across all medieval nunneries or throughout the entire medieval period. Many convents, particularly those established early in the Middle Ages or those with strong aristocratic patronage, were immensely wealthy institutions. They owned vast tracts of land, held rights to mills, fisheries, and markets, and received substantial revenues from rents and tithes. This wealth translated directly into a more comfortable and sometimes even luxurious lifestyle for their inhabitants. Consider the powerful imperial abbesses of the Holy Roman Empire, such as those of Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, or Essen. These abbeys were not just religious centers, they were economic powerhouses. The abbess of Quedlinburg, for instance, commanded extensive landholdings, administered towns, and held judicial authority. Her wealth was not simply for spiritual pursuits. It supported a large household including numerous servants, chaplains, and administrators, and allowed for the construction and maintenance of magnificent churches and monastic buildings. Records from the Abbey of Essen indicate expenditures on fine textiles, exquisite liturgical objects, and even luxurious furnishings, showcasing a lifestyle far removed from destitution. These abbesses lived in considerable comfort, befitting their noble status and administrative responsibilities. Even within less prominent convents, the standard of living could vary greatly depending on their endowments and the social status of their entrants. For many aristocratic women, entering a convent did not mean abandoning their accustomed comforts entirely. They often brought dowries of land, money, or goods that further enriched the convent. While individual nuns might take vows of poverty, the community as a whole could be remarkably wealthy. The monastic rules often allowed for provisions that catered to the needs of the noblewomen who constituted a significant portion of their population. While they might not live with the opulence of a secular court, their lives were generally far more comfortable than those of the average peasant. The diet of nuns, for example, was not always a meager bowl of gruel. While meat was often restricted or forbidden on certain days or during fasting periods, wealthier convents had access to a wide variety of foodstuffs. Their estates produced grains, vegetables, fruits, and dairy products. They owned fish ponds, vineyards, and orchards. Meals might include bread baked from fine flour, cheese, eggs, various vegetables, and fish, often accompanied by ale or wine. Accounts from the kitchens of the Benedictine Abbey of Barking, for instance, detail the extensive provisions purchased for the nuns, indicating a varied and nutritious diet that certainly sustained them beyond mere subsistence. The idea of constant hunger or a relentlessly bland diet for all nuns is a gross oversimplification. Clothing, too, despite the stereotype of rough habits, varied. While a basic, often coarse woolen habit was common for daily wear, wealthier convents could afford finer materials for ceremonial vestments, and even for daily habits. The layers were essential for warmth in unheated stone buildings, and some nuns might wear linen undergarments. The quality and cleanliness of clothing were often a mark of the convent's prosperity and its ability to care for its members. Records occasionally mention gifts of furs or warmer cloaks, suggesting that comfort was not entirely disregarded, especially in colder climates. The buildings themselves were often impressive and well-appointed. While cells might be simple, they were not always Spartan. Many convents boasted grand churches, well-maintained cloisters, libraries, infirmaries, and even private gardens for contemplation. Heating, while perhaps limited to communal areas like the chapter house or refectory, was a consideration, and wealthier convents might have fireplaces or braziers. The construction and maintenance of these elaborate complexes required significant resources, a clear indicator that these were not institutions struggling in dire poverty. The illuminated manuscripts and elaborate liturgical objects produced or commissioned by nuns, often depicting rich colors and precious materials, speak volumes about the resources available to them. Of course, poverty and asceticism were ideals that many nuns strived for, and some orders like the Cistercians or later the Poor Clares indeed adopted very strict rules. But to apply this singular model to all medieval nunneries across a 1,000-year span is inaccurate. The reality was a spectrum, from the austere poverty of a newly founded mendicant house to the immense wealth and comfortable living found within an ancient Benedictine royal abbey. The myth of universal, unrelenting asceticism misses the rich diversity of monastic life and the significant material resources that many religious women commanded and enjoyed. Number 4, the myth of nuns as exclusively secluded and isolated. A common image of medieval nuns is one of absolute seclusion, perpetually confined within cloistered walls, cut off entirely from the outside world. This myth depicts a life of hermetic isolation, where interaction with secular society was strictly forbidden, and contact with anyone beyond the convent's immediate inhabitants was rare, if not impossible. It suggests a monastic existence completely detached from worldly affairs, with nuns leading lives entirely removed from the hustle and bustle of towns, the politics of courts, or the daily realities of medieval life. This pervasive belief overlooks the multifaceted ways in which convents and their inhabitants were deeply integrated into the social, economic, and political fabric of their time. While cloistering was indeed a fundamental principle of monastic life, especially for women, its application and the extent of isolation varied significantly across different orders, regions, and centuries. Many medieval nunneries, far from being isolated islands, were vibrant centers of activity that maintained extensive connections with the surrounding community and beyond. They were not merely spiritual retreats, but also significant economic entities, landowners, and cultural hubs. Economically, convents were deeply intertwined with the secular world. They owned vast estates, often including farms, forests, mills, and even entire villages. The management of these holdings required constant interaction with tenants, laborers, merchants, and legal officials. Abbesses and prioresses acted as feudal lords, collecting rents, administering justice, and overseeing agricultural production. The produce from their lands, grain, wool, wine, timber was sold or traded in local markets, directly connecting the convent to the broader economy. Here, records from the Cistercian nunnery of Marienthal in the 13th century, for example, detail their extensive wool trade, showing how the sisters actively participated in commercial networks to sustain their community. This required continuous negotiation and engagement with external parties, dispelling any notion of absolute isolation. Socially, convents were often important gathering places and centers of patronage. Noble families frequently sent their daughters to be educated within convent walls, not necessarily to become nuns, but to receive a well-rounded education in literacy, Latin, music, and embroidery. These young women formed connections that extended beyond the convent, carrying the convent's influence into secular society when they eventually married. Their convents also provided hospitality to travelers, pilgrims, and even royal entourages. Chroniclers frequently mention kings and queens staying at prominent abbeys, holding court there, and engaging in discussions with abbesses. These interactions were far from incidental. They were crucial for fostering relationships, securing patronage, and disseminating information. The Saxon royal annals often recorded the presence of emperors and empresses at the Abbey of Quedlinburg, underscoring its role as a political and social hub. Politically, many abbesses wielded significant power, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, where certain imperial abbeys had a direct relationship with the emperor, bypassing the authority of local bishops. The abbesses, like those of Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, and Essen, held princely status, sitting in the imperial diet, providing troops for imperial armies, and even minting their own coins. They engaged in complex diplomatic negotiations, advised rulers, and mediated disputes. The diplomatic correspondence between Empress Adelheid and Abbess Matilda of Quedlinburg in the 10th century illustrates their collaborative efforts in shaping imperial policy. These women were active political players, their influence extending far beyond the spiritual realm and necessitating frequent interaction with powerful secular figures. Even for cloistered nuns, communication with the outside world was not entirely cut off. The letters were a vital means of maintaining family ties, seeking patronage, and engaging in intellectual discourse. And nuns corresponded with their families, with other religious houses, and with secular scholars and patrons. The vast collection of letters by Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, shows her engaging with a wide array of individuals, from popes to commoners, offering spiritual guidance and advice. These letters demonstrate a continuous intellectual and spiritual engagement with the broader world, proving that seclusion did not equate to disengagement. Furthermore, some orders, like the Poor Clares, while advocating strict enclosure, still had friars who acted as intermediaries, traveling outside the convent to beg for alms and manage external affairs. And in some less strictly enclosed communities, nuns might leave the cloister for essential tasks such as overseeing distant property, attending to legal matters, or visiting sick relatives, though these instances would be carefully regulated. The myth of absolute isolation ignores the practical necessities of medieval life and the strategic roles many convents played within their regions. While spiritual seclusion and a focus on inner life were central to monasticism, they did not necessarily mean a complete break from all worldly interactions. Medieval nunneries were complex institutions interwoven with the economic, social, and political fabric of their societies, demonstrating a level of engagement and connection that stands in stark contrast to the popular image of complete, unwavering seclusion. Number 5. The myth of abbesses having no real power or authority. The common understanding often suggests that medieval abbesses, despite their titles, held only nominal power, largely subservient to male bishops and kings, with their authority strictly limited to the spiritual guidance of their immediate community. This myth implies that their leadership was more symbolic than substantive, confined to chapel services and internal domestic matters, lacking any significant influence over vast resources, legal decisions, or political affairs. It paints a picture of women who, despite their administrative roles, were ultimately secondary figures, incapable of exercising true authority in a patriarchal world. This perspective overlooks the profound economic, political, and spiritual sway many abbesses commanded, often rivaling or even surpassing that of many male secular and ecclesiastical leaders. The historical reality was far more complex and dynamic. Many abbesses, particularly those of ancient and well-endowed foundations, wielded immense power, making them formidable figures in the medieval landscape. They were not merely spiritual mothers, but also powerful feudal lords, shrewd administrators, and influential political actors. Their authority often extended far beyond the cloister walls, impacting local economies, regional politics, and even national affairs. One of the most striking examples of abbess power comes from the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial abbesses, such as those of Quedlinburg, Gandersheim, and Essen, held unique privileges granted by emperors themselves, making them virtually independent of local bishops and subject only to the emperor. The abbess of Quedlinburg, for instance, was a princess of the empire, holding a seat and a vote in the imperial diet, the assembly of the empire's rulers. She commanded a significant principality, raised troops for imperial campaigns, minted her own coins, and exercised high justice, the right to try capital crimes over her vast territories. The records from the Annales Quedlinburgenses, written within the abbey itself, meticulously chronicle the abbess's extensive secular and spiritual duties, including hosting emperors and mediating disputes, clearly demonstrating their considerable temporal power. Matilda, the first abbess of Quedlinburg, a daughter of Emperor Otto I, was a key figure in Ottonian politics, frequently acting as regent for her brothers and nephews. Economically, abbesses were titans. They managed enormous landholdings, which included farms, forests, mills, and numerous tenant villages. They collected rents, taxes, and feudal dues from their subjects, effectively running a small state. This required sophisticated administrative skills, including accounting, record-keeping, and legal knowledge. The revenues generated by these estates supported not only the monastic community but also often funded public works, charitable endeavors, and artistic patronage. For example, the cartulary's registers of charters and legal documents of wealthy English abbeys, like Barking or Shaftesbury, detail thousands of land transactions, demonstrating the abbess's active and continuous management of extensive property portfolios. These women were significant economic actors vital to the regional economies. Spiritually, while ultimate ecclesiastical authority rested with bishops and the pope, abbesses held considerable spiritual sway within their own communities and often beyond. They were responsible for the spiritual well-being of their nuns, but also frequently acted as patrons of saints, relics, and religious art, enhancing the spiritual prestige of their abbeys. Some, like Hildegard of Bingen, possessed extraordinary prophetic and theological authority, corresponding directly with popes and emperors and issuing pronouncements on matters of faith and morality. Her writings, such as Scivias, were widely circulated and respected, solidifying her reputation as a spiritual leader of immense stature, whose authority derived from her direct connection to divine revelation. Abbesses also frequently engaged in legal battles to defend their rights and privileges against encroachments from bishops, local nobility, or even the crown. The ongoing jurisdictional dispute between the abbesses of Gandersheim and the bishops of Hildesheim throughout the 10th and 11th centuries is a prime example. The abbesses, supported by imperial patronage, repeatedly appealed to popes and emperors, demonstrating their astute understanding of canon law and imperial politics. These were not passive figures, but determined leaders who actively fought to preserve their autonomy and defend their ancestral rights. Their legal battles showcased their agency and their ability to navigate complex legal and political landscapes. The power of abbesses was not just a theoretical construct, it manifested in tangible ways daily. They held courts, issued charters, commanded servants, and negotiated with secular lords. They made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of people living on their lands. They offered protection, employment, and justice. The idea that these women had no real power is fundamentally contradicted by the vast body of historical evidence, which consistently portrays them as formidable, authoritative figures who played crucial and often underestimated roles in medieval society. Number 6, the myth of nuns as uneducated and ignorant. Many people tend to imagine medieval nuns as largely uneducated, barely literate, and cut off from the intellectual currents of their time. This myth often portrays them as spending their days in simple domestic tasks or repetitive prayers, with no access to books, no formal schooling, and no engagement with scholarship. It suggests that women in convents were denied intellectual development, fitting into a broader societal narrative that limited female learning to basic household skills or religious instruction. This pervasive belief overlooks the rich intellectual traditions fostered within many medieval nunneries, which often served as vital centers of learning and literacy for women during an era when such opportunities were rare in the secular world. The historical reality presents a strikingly different picture. While the level of education varied between convents and across social classes, many medieval nunneries were vibrant hubs of learning, scholarship, and artistic production. For aristocratic women, in particular, the convent often provided the best, and sometimes the only, opportunity for a comprehensive education beyond basic domestic training. These institutions maintained impressive libraries, engaged in the copying and production of manuscripts, and fostered an environment conducive to intellectual pursuits. Latin was the lingua franca of scholarship and the church, and most nuns learned to read, write, and understand it, at least to the extent necessary for reciting the divine office. However, many went far beyond this basic level, becoming proficient in complex theological texts, classical literature, and even scientific treatises. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many nunneries, emphasized the importance of Lectio Divina spiritual reading, requiring nuns to dedicate significant time to study and contemplation of sacred texts. This regular engagement with written material naturally fostered high levels of literacy and intellectual curiosity. The most famous example of a highly educated nun is undoubtedly Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179. She was not only a visionary and theologian, but also a prolific writer on diverse subjects, including natural history, medicine, and philosophy. As her works, such as Physica and Causae et Curae, reveal a remarkable breadth of knowledge and a sophisticated understanding of the world. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and leading intellectuals of her day, discussing complex theological and political matters. Her intellectual prowess and vast literary output utterly demolished the notion of nuns as uneducated. Her Sinfonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum also showcased her musical compositions, further demonstrating a multifaceted talent. Another exceptional example is Rotsvit of Gandersheim c. 935c-ATN 1002, a canoness in Saxony. She wrote Latin plays, epic poems, and historical works drawing on classical Roman authors like Terence. Her plays, the first known dramas by a female author in the Latin West, demonstrate a deep familiarity with classical literature and a keen intellectual mind. Her Gesta Autonis, a history of the Ottonian dynasty, shows her engagement with contemporary political history. Her works were recognized and celebrated in her own time, indicating that intellectual achievement by nuns was not always overlooked. Beyond these exceptional figures, many convents were active in the production of manuscripts. Nuns spent countless hours copying, illuminating, and binding books, a meticulous and intellectually demanding task. These manuscripts included not only liturgical texts, but also historical chronicles, scientific treatises, and even secular literature. The scriptorium of the Abbey of Westerbrunn, for instance, housed a number of highly skilled female scribes who produced exquisite illuminated manuscripts, demonstrating their mastery of language, calligraphy, and artistic design. This work was not merely copying, it often involved the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. Furthermore, many nunneries functioned as schools for noble girls, educating them in Latin, mathematics, music, and the liberal arts, even if these girls were not destined for a religious life. This role as educators further highlights the high levels of literacy and intellectual capability present within these communities. The curriculum offered at these monastic schools often surpassed that available to girls in secular households. The possession of extensive libraries was common in many convents. The library of the Abbey of St. John in Mustare, a Benedictine convent, contained a significant collection of theological, historical, and scientific texts, which the nuns used for study and intellectual enrichment. Such libraries were not just repositories of knowledge, but active centers for learning and contemplation. The myth of uneducated nuns fundamentally misunderstands the role of many medieval convents as havens of learning and intellectual endeavor for women. While not every nun was a scholar, the opportunities for education and intellectual growth within monastic life were often far superior to those available to women in the secular world. These institutions preserved knowledge, fostered literacy, and produced remarkable intellectual and artistic works, demonstrating that medieval nuns were far from ignorant or uneducated. Number 7. The myth of nunneries as universally serene and harmonious havens. The popular imagination often paints medieval nunneries as places of unwavering peace, serenity, and spiritual harmony, where cloistered women lived in blissful accord, free from the squabbles, jealousies, and power struggles of the outside world. This myth suggests an idyllic sanctuary, a haven of tranquility, where spiritual devotion smoothly guided every interaction, and internal conflict was virtually non-existent. It implies that the rigid discipline and shared religious purpose automatically eliminated human frailties and ensured a perpetually harmonious existence. This romanticized view ignores the very human dynamics that inevitably played out within any community, monastic or otherwise, and the specific challenges inherent in medieval convent life. While nunneries certainly aimed to foster spiritual peace and communal harmony, the historical records reveal that they were far from immune to internal strife, personal disagreements, and even significant power struggles. Nuns were, after all, human beings, bringing with them all the complexities of individual personalities, social backgrounds, and personal ambitions. Like any community, a convent could experience tensions, rivalries, and conflicts over resources, authority, or even differing interpretations of religious rules. One common source of internal conflict was the election of an abbess or prioress. These elections were often hotly contested, particularly in wealthy convents where the position carried significant power and influence. In families, the candidates might exert external pressure, and internal factions could form, leading to bitter disputes. Records from the Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain, for instance, detail several contested elections for the abbess position during the 13th and 14th centuries, sometimes requiring intervention from the Pope or the King to resolve the deadlock. These were not always serene affairs, but could be intense political battles, reflecting the high stakes involved in leading such a powerful institution. Personal disagreements and disciplinary issues were also commonplace. Not every woman who entered the convent was deeply pious or perfectly suited for monastic life. Some might have been forced into it, others sought refuge, and some simply found the communal life challenging. Infractions of monastic rules, such as gossip, disobedience, excessive attachment to worldly possessions, or even attempts to leave the convent, were not uncommon. The disciplinary sections of monastic rules and visitation records from bishops frequently address these issues, listing specific punishments for various offenses. For example, visitation records from English dioceses in the 14th and 15th centuries occasionally mention nuns found guilty of laxity in observance, excessive contact with outsiders, or even financial mismanagement, revealing a less than perfectly harmonious internal environment. Economic tensions could also arise. Managing a large monastic estate was complex, and disagreements over financial administration, allocation of resources, or the use of convent wealth could lead to disputes among the nuns or between the community and the abbess. Poor management could lead to debt, which in turn could create significant internal stress and external pressure from creditors, further straining communal relations. The financial difficulties of some convents, documented in their account books and petitions for aid, often resulted from internal mismanagement or external economic downturns, impacting the daily lives and harmony of the sisters. Furthermore, social class differences within the convent could create friction. While many convents drew their members primarily from the nobility, some also accepted women from wealthy bourgeois or even artisan families. Despite the ideal of monastic equality, pre-existing social hierarchies could sometimes persist, leading to tensions between nuns of different backgrounds regarding privileges, roles, or respect. The expectation that noble women would receive certain considerations, such as larger private cells or better food, could naturally lead to resentment among those from humbler origins. Even external political events could sow discord within the convent walls. During periods of war, political upheaval, or religious reform, convents could become internally divided along political or theological lines, mirroring conflicts in the wider society. The impact of the Black Death, for instance, led to significant challenges for many communities. As nuns died, revenues declined, and new, perhaps less disciplined, recruits had to be quickly brought in, putting immense strain on the remaining sisters in the established order. The myth of unwavering serenity in medieval nunneries is a romanticized simplification. While many convents undoubtedly achieved periods of great spiritual peace and communal support, they were also human institutions, subject to the same challenges, conflicts, and human failings as any other group of people living in close proximity. The records of internal disputes, disciplinary actions, and contested elections paint a more realistic picture of communities that, despite their spiritual ideals, still had to navigate the complexities of human relationships and the practical demands of their existence. Number 8, the myth of nuns as primarily focused on penance and self-flagellation. A persistent myth surrounding medieval nuns is that their lives were overwhelmingly dominated by rigorous penance, self-flagellation, and extreme acts of physical suffering, with an almost obsessive focus on mortifying the flesh to achieve spiritual purity. This narrative often conjures images of nuns engaged in constant self-inflicted pain, denying themselves every comfort, and living in a perpetual state of grim austerity, driven by an almost pathological fear of sin and a desire for atonement. This myth suggests that their spiritual journey was primarily about self-punishment and bodily torment, with little room for joy, intellectual pursuit, or communal life beyond these harsh disciplines. While penance and self-denial were indeed important aspects of medieval Christian spirituality for both men and women, and certain ascetic practices were adopted by some individuals and religious orders, the idea that all nuns universally engaged in extreme self-flagellation or lived lives solely defined by intense physical suffering is a gross exaggeration and a misrepresentation of the broader monastic experience. The primary focus of monastic life was spiritual contemplation, prayer, communal living, and work, not necessarily constant physical torment. The Benedictine rule, which formed the basis for most Western monasticism, emphasized moderation and balanced discretio. While it called for obedience, humility, and a disciplined life, it did not prescribe extreme physical self-mutilation or constant severe penance. It stressed regular prayer, the divine office, manual labor, spiritual reading Lectio Divina, and communal meals. The rule allowed for variations in diet and clothing based on the needs of individuals and the climate, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to the physical well-being of the monks and nuns. And records from various Benedictine nunneries show a commitment to these core principles rather than a widespread adoption of radical ascetic practices. Extreme ascetic practices such as severe fasting beyond what was prescribed, prolonged vigils, or the use of hair shirts and flagellation were indeed practiced by some deeply devout individuals, both male and female, as a form of personal spiritual devotion or a response to specific theological movements. The Rhineland mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries, for example, often engaged in intense bodily practices as part of their mystical experiences, seeking a deeper union with God. Some women, like Christina of Markiate in the 12th century, known for her rigorous asceticism and visions, embodied this individual pursuit of extreme piety. However, these were often individual choices and not necessarily institutional requirements for all nuns or typical of the average convent. To project these intense personal devotions onto the entire population of medieval nuns is misleading. The daily life of a nun was far more structured around the liturgical cycle, communal activities, and productive work than around constant self-mortification. Nuns spent significant portions of their day in choir, chanting the divine office a series of prayers at set hours. They engaged in manual labor, which could include gardening, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, or copying manuscripts. Many nunneries were productive enterprises creating textiles, vestments, and illuminated books, all of which required skill, focus, and sustained effort, not constant self-punishment. The work itself, often performed in silence, was considered a form of prayer and spiritual discipline. Furthermore, many nunneries served as centers of hospitality, education, and artistic patronage. They provided shelter for travelers, cared for the sick and poor, and educated aristocratic girls. These roles required practical engagement with the world and a focus on community service, which stood in contrast to a life solely consumed by internal acts of penance. The extensive libraries found in many convents and the intellectual pursuits of nuns like Hildegard of Bingen or Rotsvied of Gandersheim demonstrate a focus on mental and spiritual development that went far beyond mere physical mortification. Their scholarship and creative output were deeply valued, suggesting a holistic approach to spiritual growth that included intellectual endeavor. While monastic life certainly involved discipline and self-control, aimed at overcoming worldly attachments and fostering spiritual growth, it was generally designed to be sustainable. Extreme forms of penance, if practiced by individuals, were often undertaken with the guidance of a spiritual director to ensure they did not undermine the individual's health or the community's stability. The abbess had a responsibility to ensure the well-being of her nuns, and overly harsh practices could be seen as detrimental to the community. The myth of nuns is primarily focused on penance and self-flagellation oversimplifies a rich and varied spiritual landscape. It neglects the emphasis on communal prayer, intellectual activity, productive labor, and charitable service that formed the core of monastic life for countless medieval women. While acts of penance were part of the spiritual toolkit, they were by no means the sole or defining characteristic of every nun's existence, nor were they universally practiced in the extreme ways often imagined. Number 9. The myth of nuns as primarily passive recipients of male clerical authority. A widespread misconception holds that medieval nuns were merely passive recipients of male clerical authority, always subservient to bishops, priests, and male monastic superiors, with no independent voice or agency in matters of faith, governance, or their own spiritual lives. This myth suggests that their religious lives were entirely dictated by men, reducing them to subordinate figures whose only role was to obey and conform to a male-dominated ecclesiastical hierarchy. It implies that nuns had no original theological insights, no leadership capacity that wasn't approved by men, and no ability to shape their own spiritual destiny. This perspective fundamentally overlooks the complex ways in which nuns, and especially abbesses, often asserted their autonomy, challenged male oversight, and carved out significant spheres of influence within and beyond the official church structure. The historical record provides abundant evidence that many medieval nuns, particularly powerful abbesses, were far from passive. They frequently engaged in spirited resistance against male clerical interference, defended their rights and privileges, and even initiated religious reforms. Their relationships with male authority figures were often dynamic, characterized by negotiations, strategic alliances, and sometimes outright defiance. One of the most striking examples of resistance to male clerical authority comes from the numerous jurisdictional disputes between abbesses and local bishops. Many ancient and wealthy abbeys, particularly those with royal or imperial foundations, held special privileges, often making them exempt from direct episcopal control. These exempt abbeys were directly under the authority of the pope or the emperor, bypassing the local bishop entirely. When bishops attempted to assert control over these convents, abbesses fiercely defended their traditional liberties. The protracted conflict between the abbesses of Gandersheim and the bishops of Hildesheim over who held jurisdiction over the abbey's spiritual and temporal affairs lasted for centuries, involving appeals to emperors and popes. The Abbesses consistently articulated their position, presented legal arguments, and rallied powerful allies to their cause. These women were not shrinking violets, they were tenacious legal and political strategists. Those records from the papal chancellery reveal the detailed legal arguments presented by the Abbesses, demonstrating their deep understanding of canon law and their unwavering resolve. Furthermore, many abbesses held considerable temporal power, comparable to or even exceeding that of many bishops or secular lords. As mentioned earlier, imperial abbesses in Germany, like those of Quedlinburg or Essen, commanded vast territories, raised armies, minted coins, and held seats in the imperial diet. Their secular authority provided a strong foundation for asserting their independence within the ecclesiastical sphere. While they recognized the ultimate spiritual authority of the Pope, they often saw themselves as equals to bishops in temporal matters and fiercely resisted attempts to diminish their unique prerogatives. The Annales Quedlinburgenses repeatedly emphasized the Abbesses' interactions with emperors and their role in imperial politics, which often put them on a par with or even above local male clergy. Nuns also played a significant role in developing and disseminating theological and mystical thought, sometimes with an independence that challenged conventional male clerical interpretations. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is a prime example. Her prophetic visions and theological writings, while initially scrutinized by male clerics, eventually gained papal approval. She corresponded directly with popes, emperors, and leading bishops, offering spiritual guidance and even sharp rebukes. Her authority stemmed from her perceived divine inspiration, and she did not hesitate to use it to advise or admonish powerful men, effectively asserting a unique spiritual authority that transcended traditional hierarchical structures. Her vast body of written work, including theological treatises and letters, stands as a testament to her independent intellectual and spiritual voice. The very establishment of new religious orders or reforms within existing ones often involves strong female leadership, sometimes in direct collaboration with or even in guiding male counterparts. The Order of Fontevraud, founded by Robert of Arbessel in the 12th century, was a double monastery housing both monks and nuns governed by an abbess. This structure, where men were explicitly placed under the authority of a woman, was revolutionary and demonstrated a remarkable assertion of female leadership within a male-dominated religious landscape. The Abbess of Fontevraud ruled over both male and female communities, managing vast estates and exercising significant spiritual and administrative authority. This was a clear example of female leadership being acknowledged and structured into the very fabric of an ecclesiastical order. Finally, while nuns were subject to male oversight in a broad sense, the day-to-day spiritual life and internal governance of a convent were largely managed by the abbess and her senior nuns. They were responsible for interpreting and applying the rule, overseeing the spiritual formation of their sisters, and making decisions about daily life. The spiritual direction provided by a male confessor was often a private matter, and the overall spiritual climate of the convent was shaped by the abbess and the collective spiritual practices of the community. The myth of nuns as simply passive recipients of male clerical authority ignores centuries of active female agency, leadership, and intellectual contribution within the medieval church. Nuns, particularly powerful abbesses, were often strategic, assertive, and influential figures who carved out significant spheres of autonomy, engaged in complex power dynamics with male authorities, and left an indelible mark on the religious, social, and political landscape of the Middle Ages. They were not just followers, but leaders, thinkers, and spiritual forces in their own right.